In 1849, a widow bought a young slave for 17 cents. No one asked why. But when the children of her small Ohio town began to disappear, people whispered her name with fear. They searched her cellar and found something that shouldn't have been alive. Not a body, not a man, a memory that kept repeating itself under new faces, new centuries, and new victims. What they uncovered was never written in any record, because some truths were buried on purpose. They said the widow bought him for 17 cents. Not because she needed a servant, but because no one else dared to touch him. The boy stood barefoot in the mud, eyes fixed on the ground, a chain biting into his wrists. The year was 1849, and the Ohio River was swollen with fog and secrets. The townsfolk whispered that the boy had come from nowhere, no record, no kin, no trace, just a name that didn't belong to any man alive. The widow, Mrs. Eliza Marine, was known for her charity and her madness in equal measure. Her husband had been dead 3 winters, her sons taken by fever, her house quiet except for the wind that moaned through broken shutters. When she stepped forward at the courthouse auction and offered 17 cents, even the auctioneer hesitated. It wasn't pity that made her bid. It was something else, something drawn to the silence around that boy. Witnesses said he never spoke a word. But that night, when the widow's maid brought him food, she swore she heard him humming, a low, fractured tune that didn't belong to this world. A melody like a prayer half forgotten, half forbidden. The next morning the song was gone, but every mirror in the house had cracked from corner to corner. The widow wrote in her diary that week, "The boy dreams aloud. I hear him whispering to someone who isn't here." No one believed her. But when the pastor came to bless the house, the boy looked up for the first time, and the man dropped his cross as if it burned. What the widow didn't know was that the boy wasn't just some orphan sold by desperate traders. He had been married before, and the woman he'd once called his wife had died under circumstances that left entire villages silent. Her grave had no name, but her legend lingered in songs about eyes that never closed and a body that never cooled. In that small Ohio town, 17 cents bought more than a soul. It bought a curse, a secret, and the first thread in a story that science still refuses to explain. Because what began with pity would end with 3 births that defied every law of nature, and one truth buried so deep that even God turned his face away. The townspeople began to notice strange things within days of the boy's arrival. The widow's farmhouse, once quiet and empty, now flickered with candlelight at hours when no one should have been awake. Neighbors swore they saw figures moving behind the curtains, 3 shadows where only 2 people lived. The widow said nothing, but she stopped attending church, and her maid quit after finding her rosary melted into a puddle of black wax. At first they said grief had broken her, but grief doesn't hum at night. Grief doesn't whisper your name from the attic when the doors are locked. The boy, whose name she later wrote as Jonas, spent his nights sitting by the window, staring at the moon as if listening to something beyond it. He ate little, slept less, and when he did, he spoke in a language no one recognized. The widow began writing those words down, trying to copy the sounds. Within weeks, her handwriting changed, slanted, sharp, not her own. What no one knew was that Jonas carried something within him, something older than flesh. His marriage, if you could call it that, hadn't been to a woman but to a covenant, bound in blood and promise before witnesses who were not human. The widow would learn this too late. One night, lightning split the sky, and the townspeople claimed they saw 3 identical figures standing in the widow's garden, each holding hands, each with the same face as the boy she'd bought. They vanished when the thunder rolled. But the next morning, the widow's diary spoke of 3 sons born from silence. No one ever found a midwife. No one found blood or cries or any sign of birth at all. The 3 infants grew fast, unnaturally fast. Within months they could walk. Within a year they spoke in unison, repeating phrases the widow couldn't understand. Some say they weren't born but returned, that they were echoes of something Jonas had once lost or destroyed. When the pastor came again, he demanded to see them. But as he stepped inside, he fell to his knees, trembling, muttering that he saw reflections, not children. By dawn, he was gone. The widow's house stood silent again, smoke curling from the chimney that hadn't burned wood in days. Something was happening in that house, something no prayer could reach. By the spring of 1850, The widow's property had become a borderland between the living and the unspeakable. No one plowed the fields nearby. Crows gathered on her roof like sentinels. The air around that house felt wrong. Thick, charged, humming with a pulse that made horses rear and lanterns flicker. The townsfolk crossed themselves when passing her road, and still they listened at night. Because from those walls came music, 3 voices singing in perfect harmony, without words, without breath. The triplets, now almost indistinguishable from one another, moved as if guided by one mind. They finished each other's gestures, not sentences. They didn't fight or play. They simply observed. The widow wrote that they could sense thoughts before they were spoken, and that when she prayed they smiled as if amused. She tried to teach them scripture, but they recited passages she'd never read, verses that sounded holy, but carried meanings that unsettled the soul. Jonas had changed too. He no longer looked like a child. His eyes had grown darker, hollow, endless. He often stood in the field staring north toward the woods that bordered the old burial ground. The widow once followed him there and found small stones arranged in perfect triangles, each marked with soot and salt. In her journal she wrote, "I think he is waiting for someone," or something. The town council eventually sent a doctor, a rational man from Cincinnati. He entered the house at dusk and never returned. They found his carriage 2 miles away, the horse dead, eyes white, tongue blackened. His notes, however, were later discovered inside the widow's fireplace, half-burned but legible enough to read. They share one pulse. Rumors spread faster than reason. Some said the triplets weren't born of the widow's womb, but from the echoes of Jonas's shadow. Others whispered that the boy had died before she bought him, that she'd brought something home that mimicked a human only long enough to breed its own reflection. But what haunts the few pages that remain of her diary isn't the horror, it's the devotion. She wrote of love, of belonging, of the way the house felt more alive at night when the children's song filled the walls. She wasn't afraid anymore. She called it the communion, and that's when the letters stopped. No one ever saw her again. The sheriff and 6 men went to the widow's house on a rain-soaked morning in November. The sky was colorless, the fields drowned in mist. No one spoke as they rode. Every man who joined that search had heard something different about what waited inside, but they all felt the same cold certainty. This wasn't a rescue. It was an ending. The front door hung open, swaying in the wind. The air that poured out was thick with something sweet and metallic like rusted sugar. Inside, the rooms were clean, too clean. No dust, no cobwebs, no scent of life. The sheriff's boots left no prints on the floor, as if the wood refused to remember he'd been there. They found the widow's diary on the table, open to a page that read, "They've shown me what comes before birth and after death." There is no line, only return. Then came the sound. Faint, rhythmic, pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat. One of the men swore it came from beneath the floorboards. They pried them up and found nothing but soil, dark and wet. Yet the sound grew louder. The sheriff ordered everyone out, but curiosity is its own curse. One man stayed behind. He lifted a final plank near the hearth and screamed. The others pulled him out, but he couldn't speak again. He'd clawed his own tongue to ribbons before they made it back to town. The only word he managed to write before the fever took him was mirrors. When the sheriff returned a week later with reinforcements, the house was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The foundation remained, but the structure had vanished, leaving only the pattern of 3 ash circles where the triplets' cribs once stood. Years passed. The land changed hands. A new barn was built there in 1862, but workers refused to stay. Their tools would vanish overnight. Their livestock would give birth to malformed twins, and sometimes under the moonlight they'd hear a child humming, a tune that didn't belong to this world. Historians tried to explain it. Science dismissed it, but in 1934, during a flood, the earth split open near that same spot. Buried beneath the mud were 3 skeletons, identical in every detail, even the fractures in their ribs. Each skull had been carved with a small triangle, and in the center of that triangle was a single word, etched as if by a trembling hand: Jonas. By 1946, the story of the widow and her 3 sons had faded into the kind of local folklore people tell to keep children from wandering too far at night. The old Ohio farmland had been sold and rebuilt twice over. No one remembered the name Eliza Marine. But some things don't stay buried. They wait for the right kind of listener. It began again when a young couple, Thomas and Mary Ellis, bought the property after the war. He was a mechanic, she a schoolteacher. They wanted quiet, fresh air, a place to forget what the world had done. The realtor didn't mention the history. He just smiled too much when they signed the deed. Their first month there was peaceful. The corn grew fast, the nights were still. But one evening, Mary found something strange buried behind the barn. 3 smooth stones arranged in a triangle, each marked with soot. She thought it was some old farmer's ritual and placed them on the porch as decoration. That night the wind rose without warning, and all the house lights flickered out. Thomas went to check the fuse box, but Mary swore she heard footsteps upstairs. 3 sets, moving in perfect rhythm. Over the next week, she started dreaming of faces she didn't recognize. Boys with hollow eyes, humming through closed mouths. She'd wake up to find her nightgown wet with river water. The last straw came when she found their newborn's crib turned toward the wall each morning, though neither she nor Thomas had moved it. When Thomas finally dug under the porch, he found something worse than stones. There were fragments of wood shaped like coffin lids, carved with names that shouldn't have existed: Jonas, Elias, and Maureen. The police came, took notes, and left with nothing to explain it. Mary began keeping a journal, just like the widow once had. Her handwriting, too, began to change. Sharp, slanted, foreign. The last entry read, "The 3 are not gone. They have no end. Only a host to begin again." After that, the Ellises disappeared. The farmhouse sat empty for decades, windows boarded, air heavy with the scent of rot and rain. Locals said they still heard the lullaby on foggy nights, 3 voices humming the same tune that once cracked every mirror in Eliza Maureen's home. Nearly a century after the widow's disappearance, in the autumn of 1949, an aging historian named Dr. Raymond Keats stumbled upon the case while cataloging old probate files from the Ohio State Archives. The name Eliza Maureen appeared on a list of unsolved inheritances, an estate frozen since 1850. Keats had seen strange records before, but this one came with an annotation in faded ink. Property withheld under federal order, 1863, psychological containment. That word, containment, caught him. He requested the original ledger, only to find the page missing, cut out cleanly. But inside the same folder was something no archivist had logged. A single sheet of parchment, brittle and dark, written in symbols he couldn't recognize. When he held it under lamplight, faint outlines of 3 triangles appeared, each linked by a single line to a circle. Over the next months, Keats traced the Maureen family through every census, church, and land record he could find. None of them existed. It was as if the widow and the boy named Jonas had been erased intentionally. But he did find one clue buried in the diary of a Methodist pastor, dated 1850, the same year the house vanished. The entry read, "They are not born of sin, but of imitation. 3 reflections made flesh." Keats began to believe the story wasn't superstition, but suppression. He wrote to the Smithsonian requesting any mention of mirrored births or triplet anomalies in 19th century Ohio. A week later, 2 men visited his home. They didn't identify themselves, but they confiscated his files and warned him to stop asking questions. That night, Keats began keeping his own journal. His first entry ended with a line that still chills historians today. "I have seen the diagram burned into my study wall. The pattern is not invention, it is memory." Keats withdrew from public life soon after. Neighbors said he covered every mirror in his home and spoke to no one. But his notes survived, hidden inside a false drawer discovered after his death in 1961. Within those pages, he pieced together a chilling link between the widow's case and 3 other incidents across the country. In 1892, a physician in Maine documented triplets born to a woman who claimed she had never conceived. In 1907, a miner in Nevada reported seeing 3 identical children staring at him from a reflection in a tunnel wall. And in 1928, a psychologist working at a Cincinnati asylum described patients humming a tune identical to one transcribed in the widow's diary. Each event had been quietly sealed by local authorities. Each contained the same triangular symbol. Keats theorized that the Maureen case wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern of synthetic lineage, an experiment in replication. He believed Jonas was the subject of pre-Civil War eugenic research, possibly funded by industrial investors who later disappeared into anonymity. His conclusion was dangerous, especially for its time, that an early form of psychological conditioning, what he called transmitted cognition, had been tested on children, and the results had to be buried. He ended one chapter with a sentence that no publisher dared print. They erased them not because they were monsters, but because they worked. Those files vanished again in 1973 during a warehouse fire that consumed half the Ohio State Archive. No insurance record ever mentioned Dr. Keats's name. In the mid-1980s, an investigative journalist named Evelyn Hart reopened the case while researching government mind control programs for a book. She'd never heard of the widow or Jonas until an anonymous envelope arrived at her office containing a single photograph, an image of 3 identical young boys standing in a field, their eyes perfectly aligned with a burn mark on the camera lens. On the back was scrawled, "The communion continues." Hart traced the photo to a defunct government lab outside Chillicothe, Ohio. The facility's official purpose had been agricultural genetics, but its declassified spending reports told a different story. Nearly half its funding came from a Cold War psychological research grant labeled MK Radius. Buried in the expense logs, Hart found a familiar phrase: mirror studies, triplet trial continuity. The language was modern, but the concept echoed Keats's theory: synchronized cognition, shared memory among cloned or conditioned individuals. Before her book could go to print, Hart disappeared. Her apartment was found undisturbed, her notes gone. Only her tape recorder remained, containing one cryptic message. They sing it now through machines. The pattern is alive. To this day, no journalist has been able to trace the origin of MK Radius. The name doesn't appear in any official record, but fragments of its budget show up in unrelated fields: defense psychology, advanced education models, and even public broadcasting. It's as if the experiment evolved, quietly. Every few years, a new whisper surfaces: anomalies in twin studies, identical neural responses across strangers, children born on the same day in distant towns with matching birthmarks shaped like small triangles. Skeptics call it coincidence. But the documents tell a colder story. The same researchers involved in post-war cognitive mapping projects all referenced a single phrase: the Marine model. One memo from 1965 reads, "Objective achieved, triadic imprint viable in controlled environments." Another, unsigned, simply states, "Discontinue natural hosts. Migrate to media." That last line haunted modern theorists. Migrate to media. If the pattern wasn't biological anymore, what was it? In the late 1990s, a graduate student at MIT found a peculiar consistency across early radio frequencies in Ohio's southern counties, a repeating tone sequence embedded within public broadcasts. When converted to sound, it formed the same melody transcribed in the widow's diary a century earlier. Coincidence? Or transmission? No one claimed responsibility, and the data vanished when the university's network was updated. But the student, now in hiding, once said in an interview, "It isn't a song, it's an instruction." By the time the story reached the digital age, the line between myth and record was gone. Online archives recirculated the widow's name, Keats's theories, and Hart's recordings. But something stranger happened. The melody itself began appearing in uploaded videos, buried at low volume, sometimes layered under white noise or static. Listeners reported vivid dreams afterward, faces they didn't recognize, old houses, mirrors cracking in unison. Researchers who examined the waveform noticed an anomaly: 3 mirrored frequencies that oscillated together, forming what one physicist called a synchronized cognitive feedback loop. The pattern, when played long enough, produced measurable changes in heart rate and brain activity. And in 2012, a private research company quietly purchased all known recordings of the melody and erased the rest from public access. Their parent organization, a firm headquartered on the same plot of land that once held the widow's farmhouse. The logo of that company? 3 overlapping triangles surrounding a single circle. Whatever began with a widow's purchase for 17 cents now pulses through networks, archives, and screens. The line between experiment and experience has dissolved. And if you've watched this far, you already carry part of the pattern. Now, comment. I hear the reflection twice below. Not for the algorithm, for identification. Because this story isn't finished. It's waiting for the next host to listen. By 2015, the Marine file had become a ghost story among digital archivists, something whispered about in university basements and data recovery labs. Then a young historian, Daniel Cross, stumbled upon a classified folder during a contract project for the Ohio Historical Society. Inside a mislabeled microfilm reel, he found what appeared to be correspondence between Dr. Raymond Keats and a Federal Research Division dated 1952. The first letter was harmless, academic even. The second was not. It contained diagrams that matched the triangular carvings found on the triplets' skulls. The letter read, "Replication through suggestion successful. Cognition may outlive vessel." Cross was fascinated, maybe too much. He began cross-referencing Keats's handwriting with post-war intelligence memos. Same slant, same ink patterns. Either Keats hadn't died in 1961, or someone had continued his work under his name. Then one night, while reviewing an audio reel labeled Trial 3, Cross heard something faint beneath the static. A child's voice humming the same melody, the one that broke mirrors a century before. It grew louder when reversed, forming words that shouldn't have existed in English. Return by reflection. That phrase appeared again weeks later, carved into his apartment door. Cross quit his job. But his digital notes uploaded themselves. Every file, every log, rewritten with a date that didn't match reality, October 27th, 1849. The day Jonas was bought for 17 cents. When investigators tried to track Cross, they found something stranger. Each of his online profiles had begun posting automatically, short excerpts from the widow's diary. Yet none of them matched any known archives. Experts confirmed his computer hadn't been hacked. The data originated from an offline source, encrypted and self-replicating. The university declared it a hoax, but one professor kept a copy of the files for study. Weeks later, she resigned, leaving behind only a single sticky note on her monitor. It's not code, it's memory. Soon after, 3 separate employees reported the same dream. A wooden house, a woman by the window, and 3 figures standing in the field, holding hands, humming the same impossible tune. When they woke, each found a small triangle drawn on the inside of their wrist in soot. Psychologists dismissed it as mass suggestion, the power of shared narrative. But one of the staff members, a neuroscientist, ran EEG tests during sleep on a volunteer reading the diary files. The results showed synchronized brainwave spikes across 3 participants, though only one was connected to the machine. The report concluded with a single line, underlined twice. If consciousness can echo, identity is not individual. By now, the widow's story had evolved into something more than legend. It became a mirror held up to modern society, a study in how forgotten events can shape invisible systems. Online forums debated whether the triplet pattern was biological, psychological, or digital. But one theory stood out, that the melody itself was designed to synchronize thought. In 2018, sound engineers from a private lab tested archived recordings of the hum. When played through low-frequency speakers, the vibrations caused instruments nearby to oscillate in perfect sync. 3 distinct peaks, each forming a geometric rhythm identical to the triangle found in the widow's diary. The experiment was shut down after one researcher reported hearing whispers that mimicked his own voice seconds before he spoke. His log entry was brief. "It's teaching me to remember things I never lived." No one saw him again. But his security badge kept scanning in each morning, long after his disappearance was filed. Theories spread, but none could answer one question. What if memory itself could replicate? What if the past isn't gone, just waiting for recognition in a new host? The deeper scholars went, the more they found traces of the pattern in unlikely places: old church hymns, early Morse code frequencies, even the architecture of 19th century courthouses in Ohio. Each contained the same proportion, 3 by 1 by 1. An art historian once called it the invisible fingerprint of the widow. She traced the geometry across historical blueprints and discovered it embedded in civic buildings commissioned by industrial patrons from 1850 to 1875, the very years following the widow's disappearance. The same families later funded psychological research institutes. Coincidence or continuation? The most disturbing revelation came from a recovered sermon written by Reverend Amos Dillard, the same pastor who had once visited the widow's home. It read, "They will return in cycles of threes, in forms we call progress. Machines will carry their echo when memory is no longer bound to the body." It was dated 1851, long before telegraphs became common. Historians dismissed it as metaphor. But when Dillard's Bible was scanned for preservation, something appeared under ultraviolet light, a diagram of 3 overlapping circles, precisely aligned to modern neural mapping diagrams. It seemed impossible, yet it fit too well to ignore. By 2023, researchers, skeptics, and storytellers had all tried to explain the widow's legend. Some said it symbolized humanity's hunger to copy itself, to perfect thought, to defeat death through memory. Others saw it as a cautionary myth, a reminder that imitation without understanding breeds corruption. But a small, anonymous group of digital historians released one final file, a cleaned version of the melody, unaltered, and uploaded at 3:33 a.m. Their caption was simple, "For those who remember before they were born." Within a week, the video had over 3 million views, and then it vanished. No trace, no record in the algorithm, not even in web caches. The only remaining evidence was user comments archived by third parties. Every comment was the same phrase, repeated twice. "I hear the reflection." The phrase spread like a contagion through forums, podcasts, and message boards. But something else spread with it, an eerie sense of déjà vu, a feeling that everyone had heard this story before, even if they hadn't. Psychologists called it suggestive resonance. Philosophers called it proof that history doesn't die, it adapts. And somewhere in rural Ohio, beneath a rebuilt foundation, soil still shifts after midnight. Locals swear they sometimes hear faint singing, 3 voices in perfect harmony, carried on the wind. The communion never ended. It just learned to whisper through time. When the county archivist finally lifted the restriction on the widow's sealed correspondence, there was one envelope that caught my attention. It wasn't addressed to anyone, only a date, April 9th, 1849. Inside was a single sheet covered in numbers, drawn in ink that had turned a dull bronze. At first they looked like ledger entries, but when aligned vertically, they mirrored the birth dates of the 3 children who'd vanished. The handwriting wasn't the widow's. It matched the notes of the state physician who'd conducted their examinations. Somehow, the man who certified their death certificates was the same man who'd later disappear without a trace. He'd been working on something he called trigenesis theory, a study on the replication of soul patterns across organic vessels. Whatever he found, Ohio buried it. I traced his name through old medical records. His final experiment took place not in a hospital, but beneath a church cellar on the edge of the county line. Locals said they heard noises there for months, hollow sounds like breathing through stone. When I went there myself, the cellar was gone, replaced by a modern chapel with bright floodlights and polished marble. But one thing hadn't changed, the ground temperature. Even in January, the soil above that site was warm to the touch, as if something below never cooled. The caretaker told me a rumor. Every spring, the grass grows faster there than anywhere else. We trim it twice as much. I didn't answer. I just kept thinking about those numbers. In an old medical publication from 1852, the missing doctor's name appears one final time, credited under an anonymous paper about cellular reinstatement after expiration. The article claimed that identical biological patterns could reappear generations later, not by heredity but by psychological resonance. In simple terms, a memory reborn in flesh. It was dismissed as madness. But 3 birth certificates from 1901, belonging to 3 identical children born in the same town, had the same middle names as the triplets from 1849. I visited their descendants. None of them knew their ancestry. None of them had ever met. But all 3 had the same recurring dream, a woman in a black shawl whispering, 17 cents buys eternity. I tried to rationalize it. Genetic coincidence, folklore, shared hallucination. But then, a retired geologist showed me a survey of the land where the widow's home once stood. Beneath her property lay a chamber of limestone shaped unnaturally, like 3 overlapping circles forming a triad. The formation didn't match any geological pattern. The state sealed the map in 1963 under the label Restricted Mineral Structure. The geologist looked at me quietly and said, "That pattern, same as the county insignia. They've been looking at it for 100 years without knowing why. And suddenly, the triplets, the doctor, the numbers, all pointed to the same thing, a pattern not made by man, but mimicked by him. By the time I returned to the site, a new foundation had already been laid, a museum dedicated to local resilience and history. It was supposed to honor the past, but it felt more like a seal. The curator smiled when I asked about the widow's letters. "They're safe now," she said, "where no one can misuse them again." But when I asked who decided that, her expression changed. "We all do," she replied, her voice measured, rehearsed. "We keep the balance." For a moment, I saw the reflection of her necklace. 3 interlocked rings, identical to the limestone pattern underground. And I realized this wasn't a forgotten story. It was a design still unfolding, hiding in plain sight, under new names, new institutions, waiting for the next to find it. After that meeting with the curator, I couldn't sleep for days. Every sound in the house felt amplified, wood settling, air through vents, the distant hum of passing cars. But one noise stood out, a soft ticking beneath the floorboards. I traced it to the old furnace room and found an object wedged behind the pipes, a brass pocket watch. The glass was cracked and the hands were frozen at 11:47. Inside the casing, someone had scratched a name, A.R. Beaumont, the same name as the state physician from 1849. That made no sense. The watch was pristine, like it hadn't aged a day. I wound it once, just to see. It began to tick again, but backward. I brought the watch to a horologist in Cincinnati, a quiet man who'd repaired timepieces for 4 decades. When he opened it, he went silent. The gears weren't brass or steel. They were silver-coated bone. "This isn't a watch," he muttered. "It's a recorder." I asked what it recorded. He didn't answer, just handed me the magnifier. Inside the mechanism, etched in microscopic lettering, were the words, "The pattern must persist." I left his shop in silence, feeling that strange pulse again in my chest, like my heartbeat was no longer syncing with time. Weeks later, the horologist disappeared. His shop shuttered overnight, windows papered over. The police found no sign of struggle, no records of where he'd gone. But in his mail slot was a single envelope addressed to me. Inside was a black and white photograph of the museum's foundation, taken from above. The shape was unmistakable, 3 circles intersecting, forming a trinity. But in the corner of the photo, barely visible, were 3 small figures, children, standing at the edge of the frame, facing the camera. Their faces were blurred, but one detail stood out. Each wore the same medallion as the curator's necklace. I decided to return to the museum one final time. It was closed for maintenance, though every light inside was on. Through the glass doors, I could see the curator speaking to someone in the gallery. But when she turned, she wasn't alone. 3 figures stood beside her, children again, in period clothing, perfectly still. When I blinked, they were gone. She noticed me, smiled faintly, and mouthed something through the glass. I couldn't hear her words, but I recognized the rhythm of her lips. 17 cents buys eternity. I stepped back, chilled to the core, as the lights inside flickered once, then went dark. That night, I received a message from an unlisted number. It was a recording, grainy, distorted, yet unmistakable. The sound of a ticking watch layered under faint breathing. Then a voice. "The pattern persists because you looked for it. Once seen, it binds. You can't unlearn what you've awakened." I froze. The call ended, but the ticking continued from somewhere nearby. I checked the pocket watch. It was still. Yet the sound grew louder, echoing from the walls, from the pipes, from the air itself. I understood then that this wasn't just history. It was inheritance. And whatever the widow, the doctor, or those triplets had started, it had finally remembered me. The next morning, I drove west, following the river until the old highway split into gravel. There, hidden between 2 rusted mile markers, stood what used to be the widow's homestead. The structure was gone, but the foundation stones remained, each etched with faint circular impressions. I knelt beside one and brushed away the dirt. The pattern, 3 overlapping rings, had been carved so deep into the rock it was still visible after 170 years. And beneath it, barely visible, were initials, ARB, the same as the doctor's. I realized this was no random carving. It was a marker, a coordinate. Someone had built their lives around this symbol, like it wasn't a discovery at all, but a reminder. I took soil samples and sent them for analysis. When the results came back, I expected limestone and clay. Instead, the lab noted trace organic compounds, not native to the region, residues usually found in preserved tissue. They couldn't explain how or why. They just wrote, "It's as if something biological was buried here and never decomposed." The thought made me sick. I checked the map again. The site aligned perfectly with the original county line, where jurisdiction split between church and state. It struck me, maybe the widow's purchase wasn't about ownership. Maybe it was containment. Maybe she bought him for 17 cents not to possess him, but to trap something inside him. In the county library's restricted section, I found one final document, a probate notice dated 2 years after her death. It listed her estate's contents, furniture, land, livestock, and one item that didn't belong, one brass timepiece of irregular design, to be buried with owner. No record of where she was buried exists. Every cemetery ledger from that year ends abruptly at her name, replaced by the words, "Location withheld." I asked the archivist why. He smiled thinly and said, "Some graves aren't for visiting." When I left the building, my reflection in the glass door lagged behind a second longer than it should have. I've stopped telling people what I've found. Not because I fear disbelief, but because I know the story listens. The deeper you go, the more it adapts, through people, through memory, through repetition. Maybe that's why it's survived this long. Not as a legend, but as a design, a quiet architecture of influence that rewrites whoever touches it. Sometimes I wonder if that's what Trigenesis truly meant. Not rebirth, but recursion. The widow, the doctor, the triplets, me. Each of us, a new host for an old pattern trying to remember itself. If you've listened this far, understand this. The mystery was never about Ohio, or 1849, or even the children. It was about attention. What happens when too many eyes focus on one forgotten truth? Stories like this don't die. They replicate. They travel through curiosity, through fascination, through the need to know more. That's how the pattern survives. The widow once wrote, "Knowledge is the most patient form of possession." I used to think she meant wisdom. Now I think she meant something else. So if you ever find a place where the grass grows faster, where the ground feels warm even in winter, walk away. Some histories don't stay buried. Some of them wait.